joined our YouTube Live, Twitter Live, and Facebook Live. So we'll get on with the show. And I'd really appreciate any prompts. We're getting some really, really great questions, far better than the ones that I can think of myself. And please do join in. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we're discussing the buying, selling, and enslaving of people in the 21st century, in other words, today, and how we stop it. With guests, Dr. Sandra Morgan, Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice at Vanguard University, and Annie Rodriguez, Executive Director of Generate Hope Incorporated in San Diego, California. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show and we'll announce results. And questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you both for joining us. It's just wonderful to have you. It's such an important topic, and it's out of sight. And that's the thing that we're trying to correct, do a small part to correct today. I know you spend your entire careers, you and your staffs, your boards, your donors spend so much of your resource in this life to correct this. So I'm going to set you up. I'm going to go over to you, Sandra. But I just want to sort of introduce the topic by saying that although slavery and human trafficking in American Europe was driven underground in the 19th century, it's still here with us. And today's revenue totals from this form of slavery and the buying and selling of human beings, it totals an industry-wide $150 billion annually. And that's according to the International Labor Organization. Now, we're not talking euphemistically, we're talking about real buying and real selling of human beings. Children and adults are primarily traded to extract profit from their labor and to be sex workers. And the profits themselves are what is driving international growth. And the growth is indeed international. And we are seeing this really pervade the world. So, Dr. Morgan, let's start with you. Could you just help us understand the sheer scale of this issue and how it has infected the world, and we'll talk about how we can stop it. But let's just talk about the scale of this issue.
From a global perspective, there isn't a continent that has no signs of human trafficking. So globally, this is an issue. And I appreciate that you have bracketed this with sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, according to most research, is about 3 times as prevalent as sex trafficking. And in labor trafficking, there is a great deal of abuse and sexual assault as well. So I want our listeners to have empathy for both types of human trafficking. My background's pediatric nursing. I teach at a traditional undergrad university. And so I learn a lot when I study children. And I discovered in Africa, there is a greeting among Maasai warriors: how are all the children? And as I began to explore that, if the children are doing well, then the adults are doing well. And so I want to use the latest report that came out from the International Labor Affairs Bureau that shows increases in child labor and child trafficking, which included moving from 72.5 million of children in hazardous work to 79 million in 2020, and going from 152 million of children in child labor to 160. So we're losing ground. We're not making progress. And the idea of demand that drives the focus from a business perspective of cheap products and a higher profit margin, greed is what drives human trafficking. And it's not just business owners, it's ours. When we shop, human trafficking is on the rack. It's on the shelf in our stores.
Sandra, it's such an important point. Annie, could you just give us your take on the problem. I'm going to then go into the various programs that you offer. And incidentally, Colleen Zimmerman just gave us a prompt. Thank you, Colleen. Colleen said that she wanted to draw everybody's attention to the University of Michigan Human Trafficking Collaborative, and we'll post the website later on under the video. But Annie, could you just give us the view from your perspective?
Yes, so in San Diego, we are one of the top 13 areas for high intensity commercial exploitation of minors and human trafficking. In San Diego alone, it's estimated that there can be up to 8,000 new victims of this horrible crime. And that's just here. We know that there's been some research done about just that the traffickers or perpetrators are starting to look at children who are much younger and much more vulnerable. And so often—
What ages are you talking about here?
So the average age of a human trafficking victim is, or when they get kind of introduced to human trafficking, is 16 years old. And through the pandemic, as we have had younger and younger children have access to social media, we're starting to see victimization go down. And we're looking at children who are 12, 13, 14, who are being recruited into sex trafficking. And so—
and you're talking about not numbers going down, numbers are going up, but the ages are coming down. So it's going from an average age of 16, and it's beginning to migrate downwards. So you have more children and brought into this system. And it's an acculturated system, right? You get acculturated into this system, and that becomes your life.
Correct. And I think what we find in our experience is that oftentimes children or youth are trapped into this slavery for an average of 5 to 8 years. And so by the time they come to us to seek services, they're in their early 20s, and some, are much older and have been engaged in a life of exploitation for a much longer time.
Now, there's a nefarious piece to this, because if you're a human trafficker, if you are somebody who makes money by enslaving others, you want to increase the lifetime of service of your what has become the product. So by going younger, you might go from an average time in service of 5 years to 8 years. And all of a sudden, as someone who is exploiting others for gain, you're actually doing an analysis that is going to optimize your profit. So you get a worldwide profit of 150 billion going to 180 billion or 200 billion just by tweaking the model. We have to respond. How do we respond in a way that reduces the ability of these traffickers to be successful and takes the money out of this business, Sandra?
I believe that we need to focus more on prevention in the Palermo Protocol and in our own Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have the basic 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. If you looked at that like a AAA guide to hotels, prosecution would have $4 signs and prevention probably less than 1. Most prevention is considered awareness, actually. And so I believe we need a focus on prevention in our schools that is equitable and accessible to any school anywhere in America. In Annie's area in San Diego, they have an amazing prevention program that goes into the schools. It is offered because they got a $4.5 million grant. The school down the street from me doesn't have a budget for prevention. So I believe that we have to start focusing on prevention. I'm a healthcare professional. Public health teaches us that we have to predict, protect, and prevent. That's why we teach our kids to brush their teeth as soon as the first one pops through the gums. And we need to do the same thing here. And I really want to respond to what Annie said about online explosion. Child sexual abuse material. Start watching for the acronym CSAM, and then do a search for SG-CSAM, because during COVID, the sexual exploitation of children and adults online has just exploded, and children are offered money to post pictures of themselves. And from a physiological perspective, their ability to manage risk and use their executive decision-making is not even developed. And so for them, it seems like, hey, I don't know these people. They don't live near me. They're going to Venmo me $200. Sure. And so prevention means teaching children from a very young age internet safety and who is a trusted adult.
Let's step back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about definitions, because we're in a big area, not of black and white, but of gray, and a lot of, there's a continuum. There's a lot of gaslighting that you're referring to here, Sandra, and that happens in the labor markets as well. When you look at the end product, which is basically figuring out a way to exploit a person, and give them no choice, which is what slavery is. You're removing choice, and then you are taking from them, right? Can we talk a little bit about the definition of what we're talking about that connects to human trafficking, that sort of modern forms of slavery, and then connects to human trafficking, because the human trafficking itself is a profit center. You get money from people who might be paying you. You're trading amongst people where the supply and demand is creating this transaction, and that's creating a profit. And then also, once that trafficking has taken place, the exploitation that follows also has a profit center. So Annie, could you just talk a little bit about how you look at the definitions surrounding these issues here out of San Diego and Generate Hope?
Yeah, I hope I understand your question. I think, what we often see is a victim that's identified, that's targeted, and who is being exploited through force, fraud, or coercion. I think oftentimes victims, there's some misconceptions about how how it happens, and oftentimes we hear, these are foreign nationals, or trafficking or sex trafficking doesn't happen in the United States, when in fact over 80 to 90% of victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking specifically are U.S. born children, women, men. And I think that that's a big misconception that we often have. Oftentimes when I share with people that we provide shelter and services to survivors of human trafficking, many people say, here, in San Diego, there's victims. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about that.
But it's everywhere, right? It's in New York City. It's in Chicago. It's in Toledo, Ohio. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. Why has it spread so completely? Is it because this pre-existed the internet? Of course, the internet has sort of supercharged it. Is it really just a matter of opportunity? Do we have laws that are too weak? Sandra, you pointed to the lack of prevention. Annie, from your perspective, why is it so pervasive, and why is it so dominant here in the United States?
I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons, it's very low risk for the traffickers. So the number one kind of money making criminal element, it has been for a long time, the illicit sales of drugs in our country. But once when you're trafficking drugs, there's a risk of getting caught with a product, right? And being arrested. And there's laws that are, that people will have some severe consequences. With human trafficking, your product is another person. It's a person who takes all the risk. The trafficker doesn't take the risk, it's the victim. And so there's low risk involved in this. Oftentimes you get pulled over, or a trafficker or pimp will get pulled over, and the victim will not disclose that they're a victim.
They might not even register that they're actually being exploited in that way. This might be for them the best choice that they could be making.
That's correct. They think that they're part of this game, and that they're willing participants oftentimes, before they kind of awaken and realize that they are being used and exploited. And so, so I really think the fact that it's low risk, there's an opportunity to make a lot of money, and that there's an endless supply of victims available, or potential victims in the community. And I think that those are some of the reasons that there's been an increase in this horrible crime.
And Sandra, you had referred previously to exploitation of labor, and how that is about roughly 4x the issue of sex trafficking. How does exploitation of labor work in this?
The same elements are evident in both practices. And when you look at internationally or nationally, that force, fraud, or coercion, and when we talk about choice being taken from people, the people that are the most vulnerable already don't have very many choices. They don't have options. So when someone offers them a job, their level of risk is, oh, I can stay here homeless, or maybe this is going to be great. You and I, we've got a house, a car. We're not going to risk all of that to take that job. And I think understanding force and fraud is pretty black and white. We can tell. But the coercion piece is a lot harder to tease out the elements of that, because it's more psychological manipulation. And Annie, you used the phrase, the game, and it reminded me, Rachel Thomas, who serves on the White House Human Trafficking Advisory Council. I interviewed her on the Ending Human Trafficking podcast that we do out of the Global Center for Women and Justice. And she identified and broke down coercion in a way that applies whether you're talking about sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And I think it's really important for people who want to go and rescue to understand there is a trauma bond to the trafficker, and there are risks that the victim perceives that we don't see, but they are trapped, even though there are no bars, there are no locks.
Well, it's the Stockholm syndrome in part, but it's even more sophisticated than that. We just did a poll coming to the end of it, where we asked, where does human trafficking take place? And about 3/4 of the people answered that it takes place everywhere. But about 1/4 of them answered that it's mostly in regions of high poverty and high crime. Care to comment?
Poverty is the #1 risk factor for human trafficking across the board. And sometimes I get a little frustrated with our upside down approach. We advocate for kids to get an education because we know that will end poverty. But the kids who are already in poverty aren't in the classroom. They're picking cotton in Uzbekistan so we can have cheap t-shirts, or picking cocoa beans so we can have cheap chocolate.
Well, that's the point, right? any activity that generates a profit is generating a profit from the people who have. So while the exploitation might physically take place in Uzbekistan, we're actually funding it through our cheap goods. It's no different than if we were in the 1850s and buying on a global market the cheapest cotton that was there and the best cotton that was there, which was derived from the slave labor in the United States, from that industry. So are we all in a sense complicit by the choices that we make in this labor exploitation I'm talking about? Are we in a sense complicit? And how do we deal with this, Annie? How do we change our behaviors? How do we process this so that when we're buying stuff, we're not funding slave labor someplace else?
Yeah, and so I'm not an expert in labor trafficking, but one of the things that we need to be more aware of is where our products are coming from. We need to, and there's a lot of, and I can't think of any right now, but there's a lot of resources available online that share which companies we shouldn't be doing business with because they are, exploiting labor, and that they are victimizing people in a way that we shouldn't support. And so I think that we need to be more aware of where we're spending our money, and we need to be more committed to other sources of where our products come from. Yeah.
Can I jump
Go ahead,
in
Sandra,
and tell you that you can have 1,000 pages of research on everything you just talked about, Annie, by downloading the Sweat and Toil app. And when you're in the supermarket and you see the bananas, because we put the sticker for what country it comes from, you can look that up. It takes a moment, and it's a great way to start teaching your children early about labor trafficking and other forms. It'll tell you if trafficking, if slave labor is part of that product.
the Sweat and Toil app? I hadn't
Sweat
heard
and Toil app. And then there is a new app that just came out called Comply, also from our Department of Labor, with lots of research. And Department of Labor now has the capacity to issue withholding orders at the port. And if recently, for instance, rubber gloves from Malaysia were stopped because of evidence in the supply chain of labor trafficking. Well, that's going to interfere with our folks on the ground here when they can't get what they ordered. So the Comply app and the Sweat and Toil app are easy, free ways to have the research at your fingertips.
One of the things that we've learned through this climate change discussion that is going on in the world today is that our small acts can have big impacts, right? So is there a way that we can take small corrective acts that also have big impacts? Thank you so much for sharing those apps with us, because when we're sitting there and we're buying bananas, I mean, we read these very big stories about the exploitation of primates in the harvesting of coconuts for coconut water and so on. And if we're so concerned about primates, well, we're primates, right? It's our labor as well. And if we're going to buy cheap goods, we should really understand that what the practices are that allow those goods to be so cheap. We just completed a poll here, which was really interesting. We asked, which of the following facts are surprising to you about human trafficking? And I'm going to read a couple of different areas that seem to garner a lot of attention. That one, victims may collaborate in hiding trafficking. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about the techniques and the psychology that leads to that. And then there are a couple of other areas that victims of trafficking may not be processing that they're victims at all. That human trafficking doesn't always involve kidnapping or any kind of physical restraint. We'll talk about that. and that the victims may be of any age. So let's sort of hack those off and talk about them. First of all, this whole idea of active collaboration by victims, the fact that they don't process that they may be victims, and active collaboration. Annie, could you give us sort of a storyline that you see often that falls into that category, that makes it so difficult for enforcement to take place and even prevention to take place?
Yeah, so the most common way that victims of sex trafficking get lured into the life is begins with fraud. And so oftentimes we use a word called boyfriending. And so it's an older guy, trying to boyfriend a younger gal. And so what we see is that there's a science to the way that, and a method that the way this is done. And so oftentimes, we have our founder is a survivor herself. And she shares a story about, and asks us all to think about a 14 or 15-year-old girl or boy that we know, and think about yourself at 15 or 14 and how vulnerable you are, how you just want to fit in, how your body is changing. And those people that give you attention are people that you want to be around. And so a trafficker will groom their victim by telling them what they want to hear, that whether it's that they're beautiful, that they're worthy, whether it's that they can help them. So oftentimes they buy things for them, and they tell them how much they love them, and they wrap them up in a place where by the time they ask them to engage in a commercial sex act, they can't imagine their life without this individual. This individual will isolate them from their family and friends, and will say, you're doing this for us. And that often is where the game starts, right? It's fraud.
Well, it's also applying the logic of an adult to a child, right? And you're basically saying to a child, you're an adult, you have free will, and then you use popular culture as the connection, right? You can do this, you're great, you're wonderful, this is going to be fun, and so on. And then at a certain point, maybe the light bulb doesn't go off for 5 years.
Yeah, and I think that's when the force and the coercion go in. So oftentimes, they manipulate them by saying, now that you've done this, nobody's going to want you. Or they threaten to expose them to their family, friends, and community. And that's where the trauma bonds are able to grow stronger, because it's now like I have nobody to turn to. And that manipulation, and the trafficker will say, you're lucky to have me. And that keeps them trapped, and that we're doing this together. So that will keep them in that relationship, or in that in exploitation for a long, long time, until there's something that happens, whether it's an arrest, or whether it's an injury, or whether their brain just develops to a point where they start to understand that they are not willing participants in this, and that's when they seek help.
So, Sandra, we're coming to the end of our time, so we're going to give you the last word. We purposely asked whether people, after watching the webinar so far, whether they feel better equipped to identify whether someone is a human trafficking victim. And about 40% said, not yet, not yet. So you helped in terms of providing some insight into the labor side, and you gave us a couple of websites, which we will republish under the posted video. But could you give us some indication of how we can, in our daily lives, as we're walking through town, as we are as we're traveling on public transportation, as we are interacting with people in stores, what should we be looking for as signs of this type of activity?
I think we're looking for people that are in the wrong place with the wrong group. Shai Mahal was an Egyptian child brought to Orange County as a child slave, household maid. And she recently participated in a training at John Wayne Airport with us. And she said, oh, a white man took me through an airport. I never looked up. I never spoke. He always did all the speaking, and no one ever asked me if I was okay. And I think it's also important that if you ask them, and I've heard this from lots of different sex trafficking victims as well as, or just day before yesterday, no one asked me if I'm okay. Ask if they come through a clinic, if they come through a store, if they're at the pharmacy, are you okay? Can I help you? And if you see something and you don't know what to do, at least call the human trafficking hotline, which is 888-373-7888. And they'll walk you through things that you can do locally, and you can give them a tip. You can text. My younger students, they don't want to make a phone call. They just want to make a text. And the Be Free 233-733 is how you text. And about 20%, I think, at the hotline last year were texts.
So what you're saying is be aware, be observant. When you see something, say something, but it goes further than that. When you look at something and you see something that looks dissonant,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't look right. People of perhaps different races and radically different ages, a young person who is perhaps looked like they're in a shell, and being guided and so on, that should really spark something in each of us. And that we can see in our supermarkets, that we can see in our airports and our transit centers. We can actually take a small action to try and help others. Dr. Sandra Morgan, Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice at Vanguard University, and Annie Rodriguez, Executive Director of Generate Hope Incorporated in San Diego. Thank you so much for your work and for sharing some of the insights that you possess with us. And please thank your staffs, your donors, and your supporters, and also those people who were victim and have become
My light went out. There
who
you go.
have become inspiration and educators to us all. Have a great day, stay safe, and thank you so much.
Thank you.